There's three things I want to show you over here. This is a special blade setup called a dado blade. And what dado blades are is they're several blades stacked together so we can make wider cuts. You can make it much wider than this. Here's a dado blade set. Lots of different blades you can put together to make a wider set. Why would you want to do this? Let's say you're making a bookshelf and you need a groove cut for the shelves in the sides. This dado blade will do the good job in one pass. This is a bookshelf side. I'm going to cut a dado groove in one pass. I'll cut a groove. That's called a dado. This is a U-shaped joint. Can you see the shape of a U? There's also something called a rabbet. Funny name for a great groove, for a great joint. For a rabbet, I need to move the fence all the way next to the blades. In order for me not to cut my fence, I'm putting a sacrificial fence on my good fence. These fences cost about $300. It's just a piece of wood clamped on to my fence. I use a sacrificial fence to make rabbet cuts. A rabbet is an L-shaped joint. So that's why I have to have the sacrificial fence. You'll use this setup quite a bit in our shop. Now let's get to using the saw. Let's say I'm making a cutting board and I have a piece or a strip of wood that's 2 inches wide. Well, this piece of wood is definitely more than 2 inches. So we need to rip this. What part of the saw do you think we would use? If you said rip fence, you're correct. We have to use the rip fence with a jointed edge. We have a tape measure on the saw with a little line. We're going to go over to 2 inches and lock the handle. Make sure you lock the handle, otherwise, if you don't, the fence will move. 2 inches and lock the handle. You can see here, we're not going to have 6 inches between the blade and the fence. We definitely need to use a push stick for this setup. If you have more than 6 inches, you can use your hand. Let's try using our hand first just to trim up this piece of wood. And then we'll come back to this setup. Let's say you have a bad corner on your piece of wood and you want to cut some of that off so you can use the piece of wood from here over instead of this jointed edge over. Let's figure out what we have here. So I have a piece of wood that's around 6 3/4. I'll cut off that bad edge. I'll set up my fence at 6 3/4 and lock the handle. I'm going to cut this several times from different angles so you can see every angle. Since I can see the groove, I can use my hand to push it through. I don't need a push stick. Never use a push stick unless you have to. You have more control pushing the piece of wood with your hand because your hand's wider and has more pushing power and control. Throughout the process, I want to push this piece of wood against the fence. So my pressure needs to be at an angle towards the fence. I don't want the piece of wood to come away from the fence because then we'll have kickback. Right now the blade is too high for the piece of wood I'm cutting. I'm going to use my blade height wheel. I'm going to lower it, but how much? Wherever the bottom of this little wave is, we want that to be even with the piece of wood, and that's about 1/4 inch from here to here. So you need to raise the blade 1/4 inch above the piece of wood you're cutting. And every piece of wood is different. So I'm going to go ahead and lower it for this piece of wood, but then let's say I'm coming over and cutting this piece of wood. It would be too high for this piece of wood. We would need to lower it for this piece of wood. And now we're good. So, depending on what you're cutting, you need to constantly raise and lower the blade Now it's too low. I don't have enough blade exposure. Raise it up until this part of the well is even with the piece of wood. I'm going to start with my hands. I'm going to hold my left hand here, pushing against the table and against the fence. My right hand is supporting for now and kind of pulling up a little bit, not pushing down. If I push down, you can see what happens. We want to kind of hold it up so it stays on the table. We'll turn the saw on by pulling the pedal toward us. I'm pushing it through with my hands first. When I get about here, I'm going to pick up the push stick, push it through, all the way through. I'm going to turn the saw off. I am not going to reach over to get that, and I'm not going to grab that scrap piece of wood until the blade stops. And then I'm going to pull it out. Let's show that again from a different angle. Right here, gets onto the table. That's when I transfer over to the push stick. And the X is on the bottom corner here. Let me show you where it is here. It's right here, okay? Let me go ahead and readjust my fence, otherwise I won't cut anything. Let me turn on the saw. I have my push stick ready. Have it ready so you can pick it up. I'm going to start with my left hand, pushing against the fence and pushing down on the table. My right hand kind of supporting it. Up so it stays on the table. Turning the saw on. My hand slides through as I'm pushing through, kind of like a joiner. The X is on the table, switching, pushing against the fence and through, turning off. Waiting for the blade to stop. We just finished step 5, ripping to width. So you can see I have, this was the original size of the piece of wood, and I've cut down the width significantly. Now let's go ahead and do a 2-inch piece that we need for our cutting board. You do not have to do this step if you don't need to. I was just showing you how to rip to begin with. In reality, all I could have done is just go ahead and set up the 2 inches and cut what I needed out of this. So with the blade, rip fence to 2 inches, lock the handle, get our push stick ready, turn it on, push it through. So my hand is on there, the X is on there, take my push stick, push it through, all the way, past the fence. Let it come to a complete stop. When you're pushing the wood through, push it past the guard and the kickback fingers. You see the kickback finger come down. Then you're done pushing through. Now we're ready to do step 6, which is trim best end. Let's pretend that there's a really bad end here. It's really ragged, like a knot there maybe. That's my bad end here. So my best end is definitely down here. Step 6 is trim best end. Trim best end. As we know, this is the end of the wood where the end grain is. We'll find our best one and we're going to trim it. So we're not going to cut too much off. It's just very small. We'll flip this around. We want to make sure that this miter gauge is square to the blade first. On the very end of the saw, there's a small square. Grab that square. To square up the miter gauge, because sometimes it just gets knocked or something and gets out of whack, you put the short end of the square against the blade and make sure it's nice and tight. Then you slide up the miter gauge very carefully up to that square. If you have a clean edge here and a clean edge here, you know that you're square. And oftentimes this is a little bit out of whack. So make sure you check that before you cut. This is my bad end. I'm going to go ahead and leave that. This is my good end. I'm just going to trim that to make sure it's square first. And this is step 6, trim best end. So far we have rough cut to length, jointed a face, plane to thickness, so it's all the same thickness. We've jointed an edge. We've ripped to width. Trim best end is the next step. So I'm just going to line it up with the blade with it off. I'm not going to start the blade with the wood on the blade. That's dangerous. I'm going to take both hands, hold my thumbs behind here and pull it back. If I can't pull my fingers all the way to the edge of the wood, I'll just hold them like this and make sure it doesn't move. I will go ahead and turn the saw on. Push it through and pull it away. Now we have a nice square end to measure from for step 7, cut to finished length. Remember a long time ago when we rough cut the length and we added that 1.5 inches to the wood? You guys remember a long time ago when we rough cut to length and we added that 1.5 inches to our finished length? This is why we do this. Because now if we have a bad edge here, we can go ahead and cut off that bad edge. So let's do some measuring here. And I want to cut this off at 19 inches. I would normally take a pencil and do this, but since I want you to see it really well, I'm going to use a pen. I'm going to mark 19 inches. I'm going to make an X on my waist side. We've done that before on the miter saw. Now our blade is going to be lined up on the waist side of our line. We want to cut right on that line here. So it's going to be very particular how we line it up on the miter gauge to cut exactly 19 inches. I'm lining my blade up with it off on the waist side of my line. I'm eyeballing it straight down there, making sure this edge of the blade is just cutting right on the edge of the line. I'm pulling it back carefully so it doesn't move. So what I see a lot of kids do is they try to do this. They line it up, they get it all lined up, and then they pull it back. Well, that's not going to be accurate at all. You got to pull up the miter gauge and the piece of wood together, line it up, pull them back together, start up your saw, and cut it. If we have a scrap piece of wood there, always remember to let the blade stop. Take another piece of scrap wood, pull that out. Let's measure our piece of wood here. 19 inches perfectly. And that's step 7, cut to finish length. Those are the 7 steps done, and that's how you use all the machines in here. The only one we have left is the bandsaw.